Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, and welcome to this week's spiritual reflections. And it's going to be a very interesting program today. We're going to be discussing racism in society, and the topic today is going to be, can we say Black Lives Matter? And we have Yusuf Ahmed with us today. He's an Islamic teacher, and also he lectures on Islamic studies. And for those who know Cyprus Islamic Association, he's one of our co-founders. We shall also have, hopefully, Mustafa Qureshi from Jazirna Derneği today with us. Welcome onto the show, Yusuf.
Thank you for having me and affording me this opportunity to talk about such an important topic.
It's really, really good to have you on, actually. And it's been one of those crazy week in the media. Lots of protests all over the world, from New York to Europe, even to places in the Far East. People are marching and demonstrating. But it's not the first time we've seen demonstrations like this. Even probably before we were born, there was mass demonstration. Tell me, what has gone wrong? What is wrong? Why is there still racism in 2020?
That's a very difficult question to answer. I think there's racism because there is a lack of love. There is a lack of empathy. There is a lack of equality in the world. And we have people in the world that think that they are superior to others, that look down on others, that think that they are better than others, and ego is in the way. We haven't yet quite grasped the concept, the idea, the truth that we are in fact all equal, that the color of our skin doesn't actually matter. We all bleed the same blood, and what distinguishes us is the way in which we carry ourselves, our piety, our righteousness. So I'd probably answer that by saying that the problem today, what's gone wrong, is that there is a lack of love, and we probably need to go back to some of our principles, our learnings, our teachings, and realize that actually the world is bigger than us. The world is bigger than a race. That there is beauty, that there is diversity across the world. That's something that should be embraced. It's not something that should be monopolized or oppressed. And also that I think people also use ignorance to have power over people, and knowledge is power, and we have to eradicate ignorance through knowledge.
I mean, we are seeing like mass demonstrations, and although it's a worrying time because it's COVID-19 and people are still being urged to stay home and stay safe, but people have actually very passionately gone out there risking their lives because it's something they believe in. Will we ever see an end to racism? And can you give us a little bit of an insight of racism in this community? And also, can you answer the question, do Black lives matter?
So why don't I answer the last point and then work through some of the other ones.
Please.
So Black lives obviously matter. And I think that we can say Black lives matter. And even more, I think we should be saying Black lives matter. We are seeing some people responding with all lives matter. And I actually personally find this quite offensive because they've misunderstood the point here. The point isn't that only Black lives matter. Nobody's saying that. And obviously it's true that all lives matter, but the hashtag of Black Lives Matter is to state that Black people are faced with a disproportionate amount of racism, oppression, police brutality than other ethnic minorities or than other people. So yes, there are instances where perhaps white people might be oppressed by Black people. That's not the argument here. The point here is, if we look at it at more of a macro level, we're living in a society that is more negative, more condescending, and more racist in some cases towards Black people. By saying, oh, but all lives matter, you're essentially you're you're offending the Black Lives Matter campaign. You're undermining it. It's almost like, imagine that you've got a race and everyone's on this race. They're racing a 10K race for the British Heart Foundation, right? A noble cause. And you've got hundreds of people running this race, and you've got one individual who's running the opposite way and saying, British Heart Foundation isn't the only campaign out there. You know, there's other diseases that exist. Of course, there's other diseases that exist, but you're undermining the campaign, the cause for which people are running for in that particular event. And so, yes, all lives matter, but that's not the response to Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter is because it's dealing with a specific issue that we're facing, which is of a disproportionate amount. It's almost like, imagine that there's a car crash and the ambulance team attend to the scene. And normally they will attend to the person that is most vulnerable in the vehicle. You wouldn't respond and say, but all lives matter, right? You would go to the person that needs the most urgent need. Let's say that you then go to the hospital and they realize that that person's broken their arm and the doctor says, you've broken your arm. You're not going to respond and say, but all bones matter, right? You're going to say, yes, that's the bone that needs attention at the moment. That's the bone that matters the most at the moment, because that's the bone which has the biggest issue and needs to be looked at, that needs to be resolved. That's what the Black Lives Matter campaign is dealing with here. So it goes without saying that all lives matter. We know that's not new information. Nobody's saying that only Black Lives Matter. That's missing the point. The point here is that there is a disproportionate amount of racism, police brutality experienced by Black people. We shouldn't downplay that. We should be aware of that, and we should realize that society does need to change to affect that. Your other question was, what's the sort? Will racism ever end? I hope so. I think the only way that we can eradicate it is through education. It is through struggling, and people often confuse or conflate suffering with struggling. So, and when I talk about suffering in this particular context, I want to talk about a specific type of suffering. There's loads of different types of suffering we can experience, but I'm talking about a sustained regime of suffering, of normalized domination. So if somebody came to me and said to my face, Yusuf, you're ugly, my feelings might get hurt. I might suffer a little bit from those sorts of comments. But there's a fundamental difference between that and living in a society where the forces that monopolize the means of defining beauty define me as ugly. And that's the kind of suffering that we're referring to here, that there aren't equal opportunities, that it's not an isolated incident where perhaps an individual Black person is experiencing racial abuse from somebody who's non-Black. We're living in a society within a system where there is police brutality, that you're twice more likely to be killed by a police officer if you're Black than if you're not Black in the United States. That's what we're talking about here. And when we talk about struggling is to recognize the reality that as one's point of departure, but to refuse to surrender to that reality as a representation of the ideal or the all that can be. And so we have to struggle. We have to struggle against suffering. And there's some people who would say, no, we shouldn't struggle, because they equate the struggle with suffering, because sometimes there is suffering as part of struggling. Struggle isn't easy. If it was easy, it wouldn't be a struggle. But if you try to, if your mission is to avert all struggle in the name of averting all suffering, you ultimately end up in a situation which only reinforces and strengthens the very forces that promote our suffering. And then ultimately suffering can only be overcome by struggling. This is the point. So we need knowledge, we need love, we need empathy, and we need to realize that we're all humanity, we're all people, but we also need to be aware that yes, racism exists. Yes, there is white people that can be that can face oppression from Black people in certain instances. But if we look at things at a macro level, there is a disproportionate amount of racism to certain communities and others. And hence, I think we should be saying Black Lives Matter.
I just want to welcome Mustafa Qureshi to the show. Thanks for Mustafa for joining us. And Mustafa Qureshi is a Turkish Cypriot, British-born researcher and historian on Turkish Cypriot history and also on Cypriot history, and also co-founder of Jazeera Association. And we welcome him on board. Before I finish with Yusuf, just a quick question, Yusuf. We've had a black president in America. We've had a black president in America, and we've also got some leading names in the White House who are of African or black descent. Why are we still seeing this in America? Why is there so much racism in the police force and in the army? Can you just give your thoughts on that?
Again, it's very difficult to talk on behalf of a racist community when I don't share those racist views, and so it's very difficult for me to understand the source of that. Nevertheless, I think I'll just reiterate again. I just believe that it's a lack of love that humanity have for one another. I think if people genuinely love their neighbor as themselves, teachings, the golden principle, the golden rule, something which is popular within the Christian faith, the Islamic faith, other faiths, but also outside of faith. One doesn't have to be religious necessarily to comprehend that we should be good to one another. Then racism wouldn't exist. But the problem is that I believe the issue here in the US particularly is that there are certain communities that believe that we're not equal, that white people are in fact superior to black people. And therefore they don't treat black people the same, and they treat black people perhaps as, they treat them as inferior. And they believe that that's fine because they don't believe that they have equal rights. Or perhaps they're making judgments about an individual because of ignorance. Perhaps they've been told lies. Perhaps they believe in, dare I say, fake news, that there's more black crime, etc., than there is of other communities. But it's very hard for me to answer your question. What is the reason? What is the cause behind it? But for me, it just has to be a lack of love. If there was love, there would be no racism. There would be no hatred. There would be no war. We would love one another, and I think that's what we need to return to. We need more love in the world.
I will be coming straight back to you. I'm now welcoming Mustafa Qureshi. And dear viewers, if you do have questions at the end of the session, or you have questions now, please post your questions, and we'll deliver them and ask them to the special guests on tonight. Welcome, Mustafa Qureshi. What's your views of the current situation and news that we're seeing with the mass riots and also protests taking place across the world, actually, for the killing of George Floyd?
Yes, thanks for having me, Hussein.
Welcome.
It was brewing to happen. It was inevitable to happen, unfortunately. And do you know what? I'm so happy that our community, I've been watching even on the Facebook group as well, that our people have really taken on to the Black Lives Matter and getting involved with the hashtagging and was it Blackout Tuesday that they had, and it's really gone global as well. But I just want to give a bit of maybe a historic background. We can focus on America first, and then we can kind of branch it out. And I think if we be specific to just this issue, then we won't fully understand what's happening. So, for example, you gave the example of Barack Obama being the first black president, right? And it was something I remember. It was a Tupac song as well, where he said, "You'll never see a black president." And and it took this long to get one, and even then he was half black. His mother was white, and in fact he was raised by his mother. He spent time in Indonesia, and the reason that we call him black, and I'm not saying he's not, but he's just as white as he is black as well, it goes back to Western imperialistic slavery. They had a system in place. I think we say as well, Yedi Sulale or something, where you inherit parts of your ancestors for like 7 or 8 generations. And what they had in place in the slavery was, if you was half black or half white, you would still be considered black. And if that child was to have a child with a white person, the child would still be considered black, their status may be higher than that of a pure black person, but it would take like 7 or 8 generations for them to be, in their view, cleansed of this kind of foreign blood, and for them to be fully accepted as white people. And although the kind of transatlantic slave trade has ended, we are still in the mindset of having a half black child and a half white child is actually black. And they were only able to have a president who was half black, and that was deemed to be kind of acceptable for them. But then a lot of people coming out with, oh, he's Muslim actually. Oh, he's got another agenda. So that's one issue that I want to highlight. The other is they've taken millions of people away from their homelands, and there's research that suggests anything up to 30% of African American, and that includes people from the Caribbean and South America as well, were of Muslim origin.
What's the percentage? Sorry,
there were up to 30%, according to historic records. Say that the ancestors of African Americans were of Muslim background. The others were following native indigenous religions, not Christianity. And it's only after they were given freedom, and one thing that they try to highlight in the Western world is we gave freedom, we ended slavery. But isn't it a coincidence that it was only after the Industrial Revolution, where there wasn't a reliance anymore on slavery, that they started giving these basic human rights to these slaves, right? And when they did that, the socio-economic position of the people from the black and other ethnic minority communities as well was such that they made them stay in a position where they couldn't improve. In fact, from the French-speaking colonies, I forgot what they're called. They have a different dialect of French. And maybe one of you can just remind me. They have it in Mauritius and other kind of French-speaking countries as well, where they will make Creole. Thank you. So Creole is, we can say, it's not quite full French. They would teach them. They would make them forget their native tongue, and they'll teach them French, but French in such a way where they'll never be able to get to a high level because they're not speaking the standard French. These are still things which are going on in the community. And even now, when we look at who are the best basketball players, who are the best runners in the world, who are the singers, the pop stars, black people, we find with having black people as people to entertain us. But you see a president who's half black, and that became such a big issue. We have Prince Harry's wife. She has black heritage, and she's mixed as well. In fact, if we look at it on a color basis, I'm darker than her. But it was such a big problem, and it was such a big issue in the media. Oh, we've got our first black person in the royal family. And the Queen wasn't too happy, and they had to run off to Canada. Right? So we have these underlying issues there. But we need to look at, as a solution, I would suggest we look at people that were actually in this problem. So people like Malcolm X, for example, he at first was very angry because they put him in prison, and his family was also affected by this racism that was going on at the time. And he educated himself in the prison, and he joined a group called the Nation of Islam. Now, the Nation of Islam, although it has the word Islam in it, they're not part of this mainstream Muslims, but because they came to the realization that their ancestors came from a Muslim bulk, they felt this affinity with Islam, but they weren't quite aware of what Islam was. So they would say they were Muslim, but they had this racist notion that all white people are the devil, for example, and that it was some sort of alien experiment or some sort of crazy theory like that. And they believe people like Elijah Muhammad came along, and like it was like incarnation of God, or he was a prophet, some kind of crazy beliefs like that. However, as a result of that, it worked to bridge the Nation of Islam with mainstream Orthodox Islam. So Malcolm X actually went to visit Muslim countries in Africa, and he also went on the Hajj pilgrimage as well.
Mustafa,
and he was, sorry?
I'm going to come back to that in a minute. So
Sure.
Don't forget that. That's definitely something I want you to discuss with me about Malcolm X's complete experience of that. I want to just quickly ask you a question. So with the slavery, how did the white people justify slavery at the time? Because there's a few notes I've taken down before we started the program. I just want to see if it's the kind of same stuff that I've been reading. How did they justify that it was fine for a white race take someone completely different color from them in
Mhm.
Africa? These people who had a very rich heritage of their own,
Yes.
very rich resources of their own, a very unique part of the world community, and then take them into bondage and make them into slaves. Can you expand on that? What gave them the legitimacy to do that?
Yes. So the people of West Africa at the time were held onto an advanced civilization. You can just look at like Timbuktu. There were madrasas there. There were libraries. Mansa Musa, who was the emperor of Mali. I'm just referring back to this so we know how civilized and advanced these people were before I get to answer your question. Mansa Musa went on the Hajj pilgrimage, and en route there, he destabilized the economy because he had so much gold and he was just giving it out like anyone's business. Like that's how rich he was. But as a result of their riches and their advanced nature, this news spread to Western Europe. And because they found a new world, they needed labor. They needed cheap
Mm,
labor. The
mm,
natives of at first, where they went to the Caribbean, for example, the name of Caribbean derives from the indigenous people, the Carib people.
mm.
They were not too inclined to becoming slaves. They were quite resistant to becoming slaves. As a result of that, they needed they wanted slaves who would actually listen to what they had to do. So they went to West Africa, and some of them were sold. They were sold by other Africans empires as well, because slavery is not always synonymous with racism. As bad as slavery is, and Islam tried to limit and it had the aim of ending slavery, but it's not always synonymous with racism. So you would hear about Muslim empires, for example, Ottoman Empire had slaves, but they had white slaves and black slaves. It wasn't a racist institution. The transatlantic slave trade, however, which is the Western colonialist powers, be it Britain, Spain, Portugal, France, they took slavery to another level. They justified their claim by using religion. So there were claims that the black people they became black because their ancestor was sinful. Something like stupid things like this, or some of them would come up with the idea, especially when the idea of like evolution and that started to become more popular and more scientifically minded. People were trying to try to justify their oppression of blacks by saying that they weren't fully human, they were half human, or they hadn't fully evolved, and as a result of that, they were able to treat them as animals, and often they were treated worse than animals. That was their
Okay,
justification.
so just referring to what you just said, because I was reading some stuff like this yesterday.
Mhm.
So there's this kind of thing, justification they used once a lot of the slaves had been converted to Christianity in the United States, that they were a cursed race, and
Yes.
it comes from Genesis,
Hmm.
uh, that Noah had cursed Ham, and this was actually used, wasn't it? This was used against them to make them feel like, you've been cursed by God, so it's your right to be a slave, and it's our right as a white person to enslave you. Is that correct, would you say, Mustafa?
Absolutely, absolutely. And there is no notion of this in Islam. And the way that they were able to actually dominate these people, they took their religion away from them. They forgot their religion. They forgot their names. They forgot their culture. They forgot their music. There's only elements and hints of which that was able to survive. But yeah, absolutely, they were able to justify this claim, enforcing their version of Christianity on these people and saying, you are less of in value than we are.
Okay, I'm going to come back to you, Mustafa, about Malcolm X in a short while. Yusuf, can you give us some information about this kind of concept, this way of justifying that, because you're, and also there's another thing as well. So the white colonialists, they conquered lots of places like the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, India, why was it that Indians were not made into slaves? Or I know that most of us given me some explanation. Or why wasn't it that Sri Lankans or the Indonesians were not slaves, but Africans? Why was it Africans? Has it got something to do with that understanding of the concept because black people have been cursed by God, so this is the reason they need to be slaves? Or was that something they just sold so they could justify their slavery?
I'm not sure on that one, actually. Maybe Mustafa might be better to answer. What I can talk about is how they did use and pervert and distort religious texts to support their agenda. And yes, see, the thing is, what we need to be really careful of here as well is we hate it when people misrepresent the Muslim faith, sorry, the Islamic faith, by the actions of certain so-called Muslims, right? That's not how you judge a faith. And in the same sense, we cannot judge Christianity by the actions of certain so-called Christians today as well. We need to be fair, right? We need to be respectful of other people's religions. And I can honestly say, having spent a lot of time reading in the Bible and spending a lot of time understanding Christianity, that Christianity itself does not teach racism, because Jesus was very clear that one should love thy neighbor as thyself. And he didn't say your white neighbor. He didn't say a specific name. In fact, the story was of a Samaritan, right? But your neighbor. But what happened was that, and this has happened throughout history, they specifically went into the Bible, and in particular the Old Testament, to pull out certain verses, to cherry pick certain verses that would support their agenda, to justify what it is that they're doing. This isn't something which is exclusive to Christianity. Of course, we've seen it with the Islamic faith as well. And we need to be fair and say that this isn't Christianity per se. This is people distorting, twisting, perverting the message of Christianity to support, racism towards black people. So the Ku Klux Klan, for example, was a Christian movement. Wow. It is a religious movement. Their symbol was a cross. I'm not saying that to offend Christians, but the KKK would self-identify as being Christian, and they would often quote what they would call the word of God to support their movement, to support their mission here on earth. And that is that, white people are, according to them, inherently superior to those that are black. So that's what I wanted to add on the topic. I've probably got more to say later, particularly about Malcolm X as well, and even like within the Muslim community, how we've also seen some of this distortion take place, if we want to be fair. But I can't really answer the question as to why they didn't choose. I mean, as far as I understand, there were Indian slaves. There were slaves of other cultures and backgrounds as well, but never to the level of black slavery, as you would have found in Africa.
Yeah, for example, so we see the Indians as being used as servants, not so much as slaves. But you're right, there was Indians that were taken from the Indian subcontinent all the way down to places like Tanzania, and they were working on the sugarcane plantations. And then that's why you have a lot of Indian people of origin in some of the Caribbean islands as well. So once the African slaves began to rebel, they needed somebody else who was going to be obedient to them. And you had these people that came as servants, which caused actually another racial problem that maybe we can discuss in a different program, that they actually made problems between the African origin people of the Caribbean and then the new settlers that came from the Indian background. We've got lots and lots of people watching, lots of positive feedback. Chanel says it's disgusting to treat fellow brother or sister like that. We are all equal. I feel some racist people have a lack of faith and weak connection with their maker. Do you agree? You see, if you remember that one. And Mel Yusuf, it's a very complex subject. It's so heartbreaking what has happened to George Floyd. Also, Han Hanife, that's when he saw that his Muslim brothers and sisters came in all colors. Lots of people watching. Susanna Ibrahim says, thank you, Mustafa, for explaining the background of slavery. And Alimullah, it's important to note that white Irish slaves were taken to America before black slavery. So slavery has actually been going on for centuries and centuries and centuries. Before we discuss Malcolm X and his journey, because I'm sure a lot of people will be intrigued, I posted the Malcolm X letters from Mecca the other day, and so many people linked onto it. And oh God, I've never knew about this. It's a really interesting thing, and hopefully we can do a whole program about these celebrities that sometimes people have forgotten or don't know too much about. Mustafa, what does Islam say about slavery, or what were there black slaves in Islam, and were they treated the same way as we see the treatment of slaves in America in the 16th, 17th century?
Okay. Well, if I may, I'd like to give more of a historic context in terms of how the Islamic civilization dealt with it, and perhaps our brother Yusuf may be able to supplement what I say with the Islamic sources. So, from my understanding, Islam gives rules around everything. So family life, war, peace, how to work, everything is very, very detailed. From which hand to drink from, it's very, very detailed. Now, there were certain customs which were so prevalent that Islam couldn't outright ban it straight away. But if we look at what Islam says in detail and the practices of our Prophet, upon him be peace, and his respected companions, we can see the direction and the aim of what Islam was pushing for. And there are many verses in which it says that it's very bad to enslave somebody. It is a very honorable act to free someone. In fact, the first caliph, who was a good friend of the Prophet, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he actually freed Bilal al-Habashi, Bilal, who was of Ethiopian stock. He was a slave by the pagans at the time, and he became the first muezzin, the first person to call the ezan. He was given that honor, and when he gave the ezan, he would do it from a high place. He would go on top of the Kaaba, Kaaba which we all do tawaf around, which we all go around, and he was at the top of that, and nobody said that, why is this black man on there? In fact, there was one example of a Sahaba, a companion, due to his ignorance from pre-Islamic times, Jahiliyyah, which they call the age of ignorance, in which he insulted Bilal radiallahu anh, on the basis of his color. He thought he was superior. That level of Islam had not entered him yet. And when the Prophet heard about this, he was really upset about it. And this Sahaba then realized what a crime he committed, and he said to Bilal to, I think, would he put his foot on top of him?
Yeah. So that's a really good point. So yeah, during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, as respected Mustafa says, Bilal al-Rabi'a, who is known also as the Ethiopian Bilal, converts, one of the earliest converts to Islam, and he's terribly persecuted, really terribly persecuted, and he never gave up on his faith, even though he was terribly persecuted. And the Prophet sends Abu Bakr to him, and they actually buy him out of slavery, if that's correct. The long time after that, one of the other early companions of the Prophet, Abu Darda radiallahu anh, he insults Bilal. He insults Bilal by saying to him, "Oh, you son of a black woman." I think this was the actual words. "Oh, you son of a black woman." And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, turns to Abu Darda and says to him, "Truly, you only have your soul or your mind or your heart is only full of arrogance." And he walks away from the situation, the Prophet, and he says to Abu Darda, "But you are just full of arrogance." And then this is when Abu Darda feels so bad, he throws himself on the floor and says to Bilal, come and just tread on my face. Bilal, being Bilal, doesn't and walks away. But it just shows how the Prophet would try to discourage that racism was there also. It was there. And you know that racism existed in the early period before the Prophet's birth, because the Quraysh, and they had problems with different tribes, and there was racism between different tribes as well, not only just with blacks or Arabs. So it was always there. Thanks for bringing that up, Mustafa. That's really good to refresh and remember those stories.
Yeah, but from a historical perspective, obviously we have the theme in which we know that no one is superior except in taqwa, in piety. So your color doesn't make any difference to that. Your wealth, you're going to take none of that with you. It's based on your piety. But if we look at historically, if we put it, because obviously I'm representing Jazeera, a historic organization regarding Cyprus. In Cyprus, there were periods in which slaves, 50% of slaves were white and 50% were black. Not all black people were slaves as well. There were blacks who just came because they were part of the same country. The Ottoman state included Anatolia, included places like Lebanon, but also included places like Egypt. I have a great ancestor who was known to be a black Egyptian, and he was very black, as black as boots. They say, I think it's a saying or something, but that's how it's been passed on to us. And he married a very pale Turkish woman, and we've never had any issues with that. So slavery did exist. However, Islam tried to eliminate it. Unfortunately, what happened is it dragged on. But our treatment of slaves, however, is very different from transatlantic slave trade. I can't stress this enough. A slave would live in the household of the Muslim family, and they would be like part of the family, but they would have duties. And often what would happen is they would marry off the slave, and then they would be free. So that when we say slave, we always think about transatlantic slave trade, and that's not the case from the Islamic perspective. Our white slaves, in fact, many of whom came from the Caucasus, and you know, there's this trend now where people will be like, "Oh, I've got blue eyes. Oh, I must have Italian roots in me." Italians are quite dark people. I would look more to the Caucasus, the Muslims that live there. You have the Kafkas and various Turkic and people like the Chechens and Caucasians, Kafkas. You may have slaves from there, or maybe from the Balkans even. So yeah, just the idea of slavery is very much different. I just want to add as well, just from statements that I've been following in the group as well, where people in the TCC group, I think some of them seem to think that we're white, and I think it's important. I'm not trying to be controversial, and I would love for people to send their ideas as well. This is just my point of view, from my own reading. But when we say white and when we say black, we need to understand what is the definition of white and black here, right? So when we say black, do we mean someone from Sri Lanka? No, no one would think that, right? We mean someone who has origins from sub-Saharan Africa. Yeah? Sometimes the Horn of Africa isn't even included in this. So that's why when we have like Prince Harry's wife, who's lighter than me, is still considered black, because she belongs to that grouping that they have there. Now with white, you have Indians who are very white. People from Tajikistan are very white as well. Would they be considered white? Well, no. White in this context isn't referring to color. As I mentioned, you could have a very dark Sicilian person who would be darker than someone from across the sea in Tunisia, but the Tunisian is considered a non-white and the Sicilian is white. Or a Spaniard is white, but an Algerian or Moroccan is not white. And I've been to the Berber Mountain, the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, and you have people who are blonde with blue eyes there, but they are not in that white category. And that's also why Greeks are white, but Turks are not white in that context. What I'm trying to get at is, even if you have fair skin, you are not within that white context. And even Islamically as well, when we're talking about the Europeans, it's often referred to as the Rum, the Romans, and that's why we call the Greek Cypriots Rum, because they belong to that civilization, the white European civilization. In Arabic, they call them the yellow people, Bani Asfar, children of the yellow. That's referring to, they would call people who are white yellow in that sense. So there is a difference there. So the whole point I'm trying to get at is, when we are trying to say Black Lives Matter, we are not saying that because we inherit the guilt of the white man and his colonial history. No, we don't inherit that guilt. We say Black Lives Matter because we're Muslim. We support the truth, be it if it's Muslim or not. We support them as ethnic minorities. I have been I've had discrimination in this country, and we are supporting them ultimately because we are human. We have love for all communities, so we don't have to justify our support for black people by saying, oh, we're white, or we can't empathize with them. I totally can empathize with them because I am an ethnic minority, and in fact the Muslims, it has been proven that they have the least opportunity when applying for jobs, and their CV is white. All of our CVs are white on paper, right? But that Muslim name makes you a discriminated person. So I totally can empathize. Obviously, our struggles are different. A black man's struggle will be different from mine. I get that. But the reason that I support them isn't because I inherit any guilt, because the transatlantic trait has nothing to do with us. I support them because I'm Muslim and because I'm a human.
Thank you, Mustafa. I will come back to you. And I haven't forgot, we need to speak about Malcolm X today. Yusuf, just a very, very quick question. Did Islam eradicate slavery, or did it? What's your views about black society in Islam? Were they accepted, or did they have the same problems they were going through with Christianity?
Yeah. So interestingly, when the Quran speaks to mainly speaks to us, it predominantly speaks to people, Ya ayyuhan nas, or Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu, which means, O people, O humanity, or O you who have believed or believe. It doesn't just call out to white people or non-black people. It calls to all people. And there are certain verses in the Quran where it makes it very clear that we are all children of Adam in many cases. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. There are verses in the Quran where it says things like, O humanity, indeed we have created you from male and female and made you peoples and tribes that ye may know one another. That you may know one another. This is my words now. Not so that you can convert people, not so that you can racially abuse people or put down other people, but so that you may know one another. That's why we've been made into different peoples and different tribes, and why we are into male and female. That's why it's not so that we can have superiority over one another. And the verse goes on to say, indeed, the most noblest of you in the sight of God is the most righteous of you. Indeed, God is knowing and aware. It also says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, O you who have believed, Ya ayyuhal ladina amanu, be persistently standing firm for God. Witness in justice, and do not let the hatred of people prevent you from being just. Be just. That is nearer to righteousness. And be mindful, be conscious of God. Indeed, God is fully aware of what you do. So the Quran speaks about justice, and there's so many verses. It's a common thread that you see throughout the Quran about justice, about standing up for that which is right. It does explain that that we are made into different peoples and tribes, but for the purpose of getting to know one another. Now I'm going to take it one step further, and that is that the most spoke about individual in the entire Quran is who? Many people would say Muhammad, but no, Muhammad is only mentioned perhaps 4 or 5 times in the Quran. The most mentioned human being in history throughout the Quran is Musa alayhi salam, Moses, upon whom be peace. And the strongest opinion amongst the Muslim world is that Moses was in fact black. Moses was in fact black, and there are many sayings from Muhammad that state this. Now, Moses was given a very special position in the Islamic world. He is referred to in the Quran as Kalimullah, someone that Allah spoke to directly. Muhammad said that he resembled the people of Azut or Shanwa, and they are the two darkest tribes amongst the Arabs. He said that Musa had the blackest skin that he's seen, and there's no man praised or spoken about in the Quran than him. There's other names that are familiar in the Quran as well, like Adam alayhi salam. Some people say that he's the first man. Others say that he may just be the first prophet. There are differences of opinion. But Adam in the Arabic language means someone that is dark. In fact, that's how Arabs describe dark-skinned people. They call them Adam. That's what Adam means in the Arabic language. And again, the view is that Adam was most probably black and that humanity would have originated from the African continent. You also have people like Suleiman, alayhi salam, another prophet mentioned in the Quran. If we look into the Bible, he's described as having dark skin. And that's not something that would be unfamiliar to us because Bani Israel came from various different places, Egypt, Arab origin, many different origins would have come into Bani Israel. Interestingly, even one of Ibrahim's wife, Hajar, many people called Hajar in our community, named after Hajar. She is one of the ancestors of Muhammad. She's a lady. She's one of the ancestors of Muhammad, a very crucial lady who played a very critical role in moving to Mecca many hundreds of years before Muhammad was born there. And again, the majority view is that she was Egyptian and she was in fact black. So if you are going to say that, if you are going to insult black people, you are actually insulting the ancestors of Muhammad and some of the most noble prophets in the Quran. I'll take it even one more step further. One of the most controversial individuals throughout history, even today, books and books written about this person, is Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. And Jesus looks very different depending on what church or what society or what community the message went to. You know, you look at the Greeks, he looks very Greek. You look at the Persians, he looks very Persian. You know, I've gone to various different churches and I've seen very, very different depictions of him and how that picture of him has evolved over time. How he looked more sort of in poverty and simple earlier on, but how he became more rich and would wear red and blue and stuff like this later on in life. But how about the idea that actually there's a debate as to whether he's black or white as well, not just outside the Muslim community, but even amongst the companions of Muhammad. How about the idea that there are certain ahadith, alleged sayings attributed to Muhammad, where he stated that he was in fact dark-skinned. Now there are conflicting ahadith on this topic. And that's normal because there are some sayings which are authentic. There are some which are, okay, you know, it's possible that it was said. There are some which are neutral. There are some which are weak. There are some which are also fabricated, and we've got reasons to believe that they're fabricated. This is something that we have in our tradition. But there are different sayings that, you know, we have narrations from the likes of Ibn Umar, which would say that Muhammad stated that when he was sleeping at the Kaaba, he saw a dark man who was the most handsome of dark men that you've ever seen. And he had hair reaching between his ears and his shoulders, like the most beautiful of hair that you've ever seen. And this was in fact relating to Jesus. There's another hadith by Ibn Abbas where it says that actually he was of red complexion and he had curly hair and a broad chest. And that Musa, but in this hadith it does go on to say that Musa was of dark complexion, tall stature, and was of the people of Azut. So again, affirming that he was dark. You've got another statement by Ibn Mas'ud. You've got another statement by Omar, who actually swears by God, this is in Bukhari, that he swears by God that Muhammad did not, upon whom he did not state that Jesus had red skin, i.e. that he would have had dark skin. So it's interesting. But the thing is, this wasn't something that was clarified. This wasn't something which, you know, was really significant to the people at the time. Why? Because it didn't really matter what color his skin was. In the Muslim world at that point in time, it didn't matter whether you were black or white. It made no difference whatsoever, because they understood within the true message of Islam that it transcends color, it transcends race, language, and culture. And they also understood that there were thousands of prophets sent to different nations, to different tribes. There's one saying that there was in fact 124,000 prophets, of which 315 were messengers. Not all of them are mentioned in the Quran. And they would have spoken in different languages. We know this because in the Quran it says we've never sent a prophet except that they speak the language of their people in Surah Ibrahim. And they would have been sent to different races. They would have been different races. They would have been at different times, different geographies. There would have been Chinese prophets, Indian prophets, African prophets. In fact, when we look at Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, a lot of the other religions, from an Islamic perspective, there is a perspective that actually these were all originally communicating and conveying the same message, and that is that there is in fact one God, but perhaps along the line that message may have evolved and become different to what it initially was. Muhammad also went on to say, "O people, your Lord is one, your Father is one. All of you are from Adam, and Adam was from sand. The noblest of you in God's sight is the most God conscious. Arabs have no merit over non-Arabs other than taqwa." This idea of racial equality 1400 years ago, over the last century, we've witnessed the likes of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, etc., all these great individuals that came out to speak about racial equality. And here is a man, Muhammad, upon whom be peace, 1400 years ago, in the Arabian Peninsula, where people were of the most corrupt people, and he came with a message of equality. And what's interesting is, yes, that it wasn't just Bilal, obviously, radiallahu an, who was known as a black companion of Muhammad. There was also the great, well-known Salman the Persian and Suhaib the Roman as well. Or more interestingly, and here's another point. I mean, we always, and this demonstrates the problem within the Muslim community, we always associate Bilal with his slavehood, but we never talk about how the fact that he went on to become the governor of Syria. We always associate the black Muslims with slavery and oppression, but we never go on to talk about the superior statuses and titles that they had. In fact, the Muslims during the life of Muhammad were sent to Abyssinia, to a Christian king who was also black, and who defended and protected the Muslims at that time and played a very crucial role. In fact, Abu Bakr and Omar, they used to refer to Bilal as their master, our master. They used to call him Sidi. This is how they would talk to him, because color, race didn't matter at that time. And this is the message throughout the Quran. This is the message throughout the life of Muhammad. This is the message that we see about all the different prophets that were sent to different peoples, tribes, with different languages, cultures, etc. And this is why there were black Muslims that were governors over other Muslims as well. Unfortunately, what happens with religion is that after the message is conveyed, even within 100, 200 years, ignorance strikes back again. And you start to see racism. You start to see Arabs starting to oppress and have black slaves. And this gave rise to one of the biggest revolts, the Zanj Rebellion. I think it was the largest slave revolt actually within the Middle East, which lasted around 15 years, because this is something that happened after that they lost that message. They didn't quite understand that it's not about color. And finally, and I'll finish on this, the other beautiful thing that Islam projects, and sorry, I've been speaking quite a lot on this, is that we're all in fact slaves. We're all slaves of God. And the word for slave there is abd. And we are all, and this is where we get the name Abdullah, slave of God. And we are all slaves, whether we like it or not. But interestingly, again, demonstrating the fact that within the Muslim community, because Islam teaches all this, but Muslims can act differently, that within the Muslim community, that when there were black slaves, they would refer to them as abds. But when there were white slaves, as Mustafa mentioned, they were actually referred to as mamluks. They were given a different title, and they were seen to be better than the abds. So this is an issue that has existed within the Muslim community, continues to exist. But Islam itself, Islam teaches racial equality, and that in the eyes of God, God only cares. And I'll finish with one last statement, sorry, and that is that God does not look into the skin color of people, but God looks into the heart of humanity. That's how that's how God judges us, by what's in our hearts, not by the color of our skin. And there is a statement to that effect in Bukhari, which Muhammad actually stated, upon whom be peace. So I'll leave it there for now, because I've probably spoken for too long.
Thank you. We'll actually be on live now for an hour, and I've got two respected guests here, and lots of people, lots of comments. So I will, maybe the last 5 minutes we'll go through the comments, and if not, I think we'll have to do a continuation at this of this program, because it's something that interests people, because it's something that's very recent on the news, and it always creeps in the news. Before I go to Mustafa, just reflecting on something that our friend Yusuf was saying, is that during Ramadan on TCC UK, I mentioned and related the story of the birth of the Prophet Muhammad. It's really interesting to remember that when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, his mother dies at the age of 6. Her servant, who is later known as Ayman, I think it's Ayman, she was older than the Prophet. She was the Prophet's mother's nurse. She then becomes his maid, and she raises him with the grandfather and the uncle. And brothers and sisters, she was a black lady. She was a black lady, and the Prophet, and she never ever left the Prophet's side, even when she got married. And the Prophet actually gets her married off to his foster son, Zayd, which is really important, because there's that kind of connection. He saw her as his mum. So the Prophet Muhammad already broke those barriers. And that's really important to remember, that she was his second mum, this woman, this slave woman, that he actually gives her freedom. And like Zayd, she doesn't want her freedom. She wants to live with him, and she actually outlives him. That's the most important thing to remember. She actually outlives him, and she sees his grandchildren, and she sees his children, and she stays with them and lives with them as well. So the Prophet Muhammad's adopted mother, we could say, was a black slave that he said, that was my second mother. So that was breaking away from that old pre-Islamic look on slavery. And that's where I'll bring Mustafa Qureshi in. Mustafa, give us a little bit of insight of Malcolm X, and we're going to have to do this show again. There's lots of people watching.
Yeah, we'll definitely have a part 2, because I've got plenty more to say on the subject. Yeah, Malcolm X, I mean, where do you want me to begin from? As I said, he was someone who was discriminated against. He was put into prison, and he educated himself in prison. He was a very intelligent man, but unfortunately he wasn't given the same opportunities as white people were. And he read so much, he even read the whole dictionary. And if you watch his lectures, he's very well spoken, really. And the reason he's got X as a surname is because he refused to accept the surname that he had officially, which he called a slave name. And as I mentioned in the beginning, the white colonialists, in the process of making black people forget about who they are, they gave them their own names. So if you see an African American with the surname Smith, that's an English name. It's not an African name, right? It means that at some point their ancestor was owned by a white man with the surname Smith, right? And many black people take an issue with that now, and hence they put X, and thank you to Hanife, as she rightly put there, X, unknown. We don't know what our surname is, and therefore until I find one which is deemed appropriate for my people, then I will put X there. And he gave one example in the talk where he said it would be funny for, if you saw a Chinaman, from what he says, a Chinese person with an English name, right? And he saw it as not befitting a black person to have this, not only a foreign name, but a name which was enforced via slavery. And as much as they say that it's all ended, this name alone is a constant reminder of those times. Now, as I mentioned, he joined the group called the Nation of Islam, which understood that they had heritage which was of the Islamic faith, but they were ignorant of what that actually meant. And as a result of that, they mixed Islamic kind of rhetoric and names and titles with racism which they learned from their white masters. The white people were saying, we are more dominant over you. And as a reflex, as a response to that, they started saying, no, we are dominant over you. The white people are the devil. We are the true race. And some people have gone on to say that they're superior, and there's been split off movements saying that ancient Egyptians were black and whatnot. I'm going on a tangent, but this is all a reflex reaction to what they were taught by colonialists. But alhamdulillah, praise be to God, Malcolm X eventually in his journeys to the Muslim world saw how Muslims were living side by side due to the teachings of Islam, and he saw white Muslims and he saw black Muslims, and that was all fine, and he came back as an Orthodox Muslim. And he was actually targeted by the Nation of Islam because he was saying, I am no longer holding these values of hate, because a black racist and a white racist ultimately a racist. And the first racist was Iblis, the father of shayateen, the devils. He was the first racist. So we can take inspiration from him. We can take inspiration, if time permits, even Frantz Fanon. I'll just briefly mention him. He was from the Caribbean, but he was well read and educated, and he was able to understand racism not just from the apparent, but through the culture of racism which was implemented by the colonialists. And he actually went on to tackle colonialism in Algeria, and he took on the name Ibrahim. And I would recommend our viewers to read the book Wretched of the Earth as well, as a result of that. And if I may just quickly wrap up in my title here. I was very happy to see the Turkish Cypriots take on the Black Lives Matter movement. It's very important. It's something that shouldn't be forgotten. However, it's not limited to that. Just a bit of food for thought. We have, in that kind of hierarchy or value of lives that I mentioned in the beginning, in the current state, it seems like the top of that hierarchy is the white European. And as you go down, the ethnic minorities of the West are more in value than ethnic groups of other regions. So what I mean by that is the gentleman who died recently,
George Floyd.
George Floyd. As sad as it was, and it was highlighted as much as it should have been, but that one black person who died, who shouldn't have, who was martyred, has had a global reaction, even from our own Turkish Cypriot community. And I'm wearing this hat here. I'll just show it here. See it. This is an Uyghur takke, I think from the Kashgar region. And I'm wearing in solidarity with the Uyghurs of China, who have been occupied for many years. Currently, there's 3 million Uyghurs in camps there. They are banned from fasting in Ramadan. They have Han Chinese men who are forced to live in Uyghur homes. There have been forced marriages between Muslim Uyghurs and Han Chinese. And unfortunately, we haven't had much statement. Our friend Ertan Karpazlı posted a post on this, and there wasn't much attention, unfortunately. We have ethno-religious targeting in Burma against the Rohingya. Thousands have been massacred. Thousands, not one person, thousands, based on their ethno-religious identity, right? And nothing there. We want to talk about Black lives. The Central African Republic is beating and killing people in the street based on the different communities that they belong to. Now, a black gentleman from the Caribbean, Frantz Fanon, he could have said, well, I'm just going to focus on my own people. But he realized that it's this colonialist mindset that humans have in themselves. When they have power, they have this tribalistic urge to dominate the other. And that's the problem. So I'm not trying to take hashtag Black Lives Matter, but once this is over, let's maybe look at other people that are being persecuted. Why are 3 million Uyghurs not mentioned as much as one black person?
Interesting. What I want to do next week, hopefully, is actually expand this and look at some other places where racism is quite ripe as well. And also, I want to deal with racism in our own community, because there does seem like there is elements of racism in our own communities as well. And I'm talking about the Turkish Cypriot community, and how do we tackle this? People who are in denial, who pick up their DNA results and then need a chair to fall into and say, whack, I've got like 50% African, or I'm an Arab, or I'm this, I'm that, I'm Italian, I'm Greek. And how do we tackle racism how do we educate our community? Because people are now coming up and, you know, feeling very proud that they have like a grandfather or grandmother who has probably of, or he's probably of African or Afro-Arab descent, and that's a good thing that people are waking up. But how do we stop stereotypes, and how do we tackle racism? And maybe next week, Mustafa, you can also um, give us a glimpse of that letter from Malcolm X, that very, very moving letter of how he sits with the blue-eyed and blonde hair people of the world, and they come in solidarity. So that's going to be next week. Just before we leave, yes, Yusuf, you want to say something before we leave?
Yeah, can I just take 100 seconds max? I just want to say one thing, and that is that whenever we look at the story of Malcolm X, very few people know about his sister, Ella Collins. She was a businesswoman, educated. She actually was a Muslim before she died as well, but she actually funded his pilgrimage to Hajj. And women in that time were so often defined as the wife of so-and-so or the mother of so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so, but she wasn't defined by her marriages. She actually divorced 3 times. And in Malcolm X's own biography, he says it wasn't that it wasn't that, it was that she was too strong. It was that the women were too weak. And he attributed the way that he thought, his charisma, everything to his sister Ella. And she's the one that instilled black pride in him from a young age. But you will only ever hear about Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam, again, all men having an impact, a significant impact on his life. And so I just wanted to say that there's also black women specifically that have had a massive role in Islam and what it is today in the Muslim community. And perhaps maybe even next week we can talk about some of the black women as well who have contributed massively towards our community and who we are today.
Well, hopefully next week I shall have a special guest, which will be a woman on the show, and let's talk about this. Actually, there's a lot of it's been quite a lot of questions, and we are going to make notes of these questions and do answer them next week. So we'll have actually a continuation about racism in our world, and can we say Black Lives Matter? All lives matter, actually, and we will continue this next week, brothers and sisters and their respected viewers. And please do send us messages, do send comments, and we will try to answer. If you want to be on the show next week and it's something that you feel close to or deep to, and if you're a lady especially, because we have a lot of people, women, who actually following us on these groups. So if you want to join us next week and you're quite passionate about the race issue and how we can eradicate it from our own community as well, because we want to discuss racism and types of prejudice in our own community, because there's all different types of stereotyping even in our own community that we need to tackle. Please inbox me and we can arrange that for you to be on next week. Stay blessed, everyone, and you know, the world is big enough for everyone. Don't forget, the Quran says that he created us from one man and one woman, and that our forefathers are one. Our Lord God is one, and we all belong to the children of Adam, no matter what color we are. So, see you all next week and very soon, and I hope you enjoyed the show. Thank you, Mustafa. Thank you, Yusuf.